Hello, folks. It's me again. I have crazy hair going on. I'm aware of that. Yep, it's Thursday. It's 2 o'clock, and I have crazy hair. Yeah, mainly because I don't know. I keep sleeping at weird angles. Plus, our cat, Sombrero, lovely boy. He took recently to sleeping on top of my head, where he would then groom my hair. I was asked if I put any product in my hair, which was a kind of an interesting conversation. I was like, no, it just looks like this. Apparently it looked styled. It's like, no, I washed it this morning and that's how it looks. Odd kind of brag in a way. Unintended. But yeah. But the point is, yeah, he does that because, well, if I scratch his back, he starts licking. It's just his way. And it was a very cute thing to complain about, right? In any case, I'm back with my review series, and first I want to issue an apology, especially to Mr. David Gamble, who inspired this whole thing here. Yeah, I was doing books that changed the way I saw the world, as well as just what I'd highly recommend, stuff that had an impact, not life-changing impact, but definitely eye-opening, definitely significant. Yeah, and that was all based on his recommendation, right? Get out there and read 1984. Also, Captains of Consciousness and other books, I believe, may have been mentioned then. Yet somehow it didn't occur to me to review the books we actually did in that class. I mean, 1984 was not on our syllabus there, but you know what was? The book I want to review now. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And in fact, it's one of several from that class that I wanted to review. And I'm, much like Utopia, oh, that didn't help my hair. Much like Utopia, it is a book that for the life of me, I can't understand how it sort of slipped under the radar. So, not only Chinua Achebe, but the works of Uchi Emechida, also a famous Nigerian author, and a woman. She's a very, very powerful figure in, the women's rights as portrayed in literature and women's suffering. And also Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is from the other side of Africa, Kenya. So the two of them, as well as Chinua Achebe, they were authors that we read in that class, and all of them were very eye-opening. In fact, I credit Chinua Achebe and his book, Things Fall Apart, as well as his very awesome essay as, it is, I need to look this up here, African Art as Celebration of Life, I think it was called. Yeah. So these writings, right? They were, for me, a big introduction to Africa. Its history, yes, and culture and so forth. Because, of course, as we were starting to read there, it's like, yeah, I really know nothing about Africa as a continent, as its individual nations, right? At that point, I credit Taekwondo with giving me exposure to people from all over the world. So yes, I met a gentleman from Zimbabwe, and I loved absolutely, yes, the Kashimoto Ngoi and his son. His son's name changed, but yeah, Pishu Ngoi, who then, when he came of age, was known as Pinga Ngoi. And the two of them, yes, love them both, and they both passed away, unfortunately, due to a genetic heart condition. It's terrible, terrible news within a few years of each other. And yeah, and interestingly enough, part of the reason I bring them up is because that year, as I'm doing my senior level essay, I chose to do it on the nation of Zaire, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is where Kashimoto and his family were from. Oh, I also knew their sister through Taekwondo. Sherry, if you're out there, I've been trying to find you on Facebook, man, I'll continue to try. Any case, so, yeah, I went to him to help to learn And I'd let him know what was going on with the class and what we were reading, because yeah, he was well versed in a lot of the literature and the authors, and he had a doctorate in philosophy, and he was a diplomat from Zaire originally. Immigrated to Canada to get away from the regime of Mobutu Sese Seko. And anytime I hear references to that there, it's like, Kashimoto taught me about that guy. I know who that is, thanks to him. Bless you, sir. Yeah. And so, yeah, I did my senior level paper on Zaire and basically how it was, its history, its modern history. It demonstrated how neocolonialism, which was very, very pertinent to what Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote, um, there too, we had an essay and his book, Weep Not Child. And it's like, yeah, that comes up. And it was interesting. So Achebe, though, getting back to him, Things Fall Apart was his inaugural novel. It's published in Britain in 1958, I am seeing. And yes, it's been adapted, and it is considered one of the best novels, English language novels of the 20th century, and rightly so. And in the essay we were reading, I really love that because he was talking about how Africa is depicted in English literature historically, and it all started with he was doing a book tour in the UK, no, Ireland. He was in Ireland, and a local journalist said that he invented Nigerian literature, to which he said, "No, I didn't. It predates me." Idiot. But yeah, like, thanks for the compliment, but dude, oh, read the room. Racist assumption there. Anyway, so he went on to talk about African art and also how Africa is depicted in literature. And he pointed out, oh, genius, really. It's like there was a hardening of attitudes towards Africa and Africans that you see throughout the history of English literature, starting with Shakespeare, who depicted an African in the form of Caliban in the Tempest. And very interesting. I read that book and did a paper on that actually for another. I was taking two English classes. Yeah, senior English and post-colonial literature was Mr. Gamble's. So yeah, I did a review of The Tempest to explore racist themes and also how Shakespeare would like undermine them. Using that play as an example, also Merchant of Venice and Othello. And that was all thanks to Achebe there. He lit that fire. And so, as he was saying, yeah, as the hardening of attitudes, it kept pace with all the nasty things that Europeans were doing in Africa, right? And sort of hits a crescendo with Kipling and sampling his literature, right? And what he had to say about Africa and Africans. Yeah, I do not agree with him being celebrated or considered a great English writer. It's like this guy coined the phrase, invented the concept of white man's burden. And for that, I hate him forever. Yeah, your opinions may vary. Of course, a person can be a brilliant author and a complete, piece of shit. So, whatever. As long as we're acknowledging both things. So, to get to the story itself, it is very interesting because it is set in what is essentially colonial Nigeria, and it depicts a fictional nation that are Igbo by culture, and that refers to an actual linguistic and cultural group in southern Nigeria. And so he is telling the story there. It's a transitional time, basically. It's like the missionaries have shown up by the time that this story gets going, but then come the colonials, the officers and the soldiers, not long thereafter. And the story is told through the character of Okonkwo, who is this dangerously, he is insecure, he is very machist, machismo is kind of his thing there, but it's, yeah, not like, ha. It's kind of scary. Yeah, but he is a fervent patriarch. He has multiple wives, as the men in their community would do. And that is a key principle there, right? A man is defined as someone who has met all these requirements, gone through all these initiations and so forth, and is now essentially an elder. And yes, as a result, they own property and they can have multiple wives and of course, spawn children and so forth. And when it comes to matters of justice and ritualistic practices, yes, these men or elders, they don the masks of that pertain to the Igbo religion, right? They're gods. And they are basically like impersonating them. And it's like, and a very interesting part of the ritual is, it's like anyone can tell looking at these people who's who there, but they deny knowing them because it's like when we are here in this setting, the gods are speaking through us. Now you don't know me. You don't know that I'm Okwanko, even though you recognize me from my sandals, my toenails, which I keep very well kept. Thank you. So that was really, really quite cool. And they, of course, show a lot of misogyny at work. How abuse is normal. And also how, yeah, how parents deal with their children, how the men deal with their children, and how it's really quite rough. So Kwanko has a strained relationship with his sons. He has a daughter, though, who kind of gets him, and he wishes she'd been a boy. And all of this is, in fact, Achebe making cultural commentary, saying that, yeah, he shows, of course, all the wonderfulness and richness. There are folk tales included, all kinds of these old folk stories about how things developed, where certain species come from, and the like, and yeah, their rituals and feasts. And of course, it is stressed, and this was a big eye-opener to me, I had no idea. It is stressed just how important yams, the cultivation of yams, were to the Igbo people and people of Nigeria, people of West Africa in general. The yam was not only the king crop, but it was also a means of currency. And so were cocoa yams, which I'm going to have to look that up too. I did at one point, and it yeah. It is the name for another root or tuber there that is commonly grown in West Africa. And the book also introduced me to the concept of palm wine. Basically, wine that you get from a palm tree, which is to say it's rainwater collects in these parts of the tree, and you then drain them, and it mixes as it gets into these little receptacles there, it takes on sugars and it ferments. So you have a naturally occurring alcoholic beverage, which you can then harvest. And of course, by planting more palm trees, cultivating palm trees, you now have the means to produce this wine. And yes, it is available for consumption. I'm not sure if it's available outside of, I'd say, well, if you live in a major city, yeah, you wouldn't have too much trouble finding it, I imagine. And if you ever have the option of eating in a West African restaurant, you could probably get some there. I have not. Yes, never had occasion to try palm wine, but it's interesting to know about. Anyway, so while all this is going on, yes, we see how the introduction of Christianity, it starts to affect their culture there. And it is interesting to note, he's saying that basically the missionaries were successful in winning people over because, of course, they exploited the weaknesses that Achebe is pointing out. And this was consistent with his sort of political views, in which he basically said he was a syncretist, I guess you'd say, and which is important in his literature because he's basically saying, yeah, Cultures of the world, we need each other. We're the and he uses a quote from somewhere, and I've looked for it. I can't find it, but so I just kind of attribute it to him. But the quote is, "We have had separate history. No, we've had different pasts, you and I, but we have strictly the same future. The era of separate destinies has run its course." So it's like, yeah, he's a very pragmatic kind of philosophical guy, saying that for modern day Africa and the world, right, and its former colonial abusers, right, we have to live together. We're all stuck in this rock together. We are not going to get anywhere by trying to turn back the clock or build walls. We've got to build bridges. Very, a respectable position to take there. And of course, we reviewed in class, and I will get to this in a later review. Yes, Nguge wa Thiong'o, on the other hand, said nuts to that, and was much more of a, well, sort of Marxist, and yeah, not let's all get along, but rather we need to make some very serious changes to our current arrangements, economic and political. Yeah. Anyway, so as the story progresses, yeah, it's like the first missionary they get is a nice guy. And he debates with the elders about God and spirituality and so forth, and basically trying to push anti-idolatry, saying your gods are idols, right? And so he's doing that, but eventually he's replaced by a guy named Brown, as I recall, who is not a nice guy. He's all about numbers, and so he is all for winning converts over, yeah, and he is sort of mobilizing them and militarizing them in their thinking. So that creates a serious wedge in their community. And yes, the village, they have heard of other places, other people being slaughtered by these British soldiers. So they decide to take preparations. They have guns. They have cannons even, right? It's like, yeah, the Africa that existed when the colonials came upon it, they were not far behind, the times as defined by Europeans. But of course, by this point, Europeans had industrially produced weapons, and so they had a big edge. Lots of guns, all similar parts, and so good going with, paired with the steamboats, it's like, yeah, you had the means to get around, and you had adequate persuasion to take land and resources and force people to do your will. And so, yeah, what eventually, I can't really say this without spoiling it, but let's just say, yeah, things come to a head. The division between the those who've converted and who then are also like the chosen representatives, the chosen envoys for the British authority, which has now been set up in the country. Yeah, a conflict ensues. Okonkwo is very much involved, and yeah, I can say no more on that front because it will give away the ending, which is rather ironic and yeah. So, and of course, very, very beautifully done. Things, I will say this, they wrap up when the British authority, which has been, looking over all this, yeah, they are producing a report now talking about how they pacified the local tribes, the local nations. And yeah, so the last bit is told from the point of view of this British official. He's like, he had, this case is now done. He's concluding his report, and it was important to know what parts to leave out. And I thought, oh, that's good. And yeah, years later, I would hear a similar line from Serenity, the movie version of Firefly. Yeah, Captain Mal said that half of writing history is knowing what to leave out. And it's like, wow, yeah. Telling the slanted story. And the report he compiles is something along the lines of the pacification of the, hate the word, savages of, yeah, Lower Nigeria or something, or West Africa, whatever the British knew it as at the time. So that is how the story ends, and it's like, yeah, we get into a very, very rich and detailed examination of what life was like there before the British came. And yeah, it had its faults, but it was, of course, it was their culture, the Igbo. This was how they lived. This was what how they saw the world and all that stuff. And yeah, it was definitely not how the British wrote home about it at all, calling this untamed wilderness or a dark continent. And that too goes right back to the essay Achebe wrote, right? It's like at the time, by the time Africans were being parceled around as slaves, just scooped up and moved out of the continent to the Americas. And when then Britain then followed, they colonized after that. When Britain was invading Africa, and not just Britain, of course, France, Germany too, a latecomer to it, the Portuguese and the Belgians. Belgian Congo, ring a bell? Yeah. As they were doing this and committing all kinds of atrocities and just, basically building local economies that were built around rape of the land, stripping the resources and building roads that led from there to the harbor. And that's it. That was the infrastructure they left behind. Basically just a complete and total rape economy. And also very much, yeah, slavery did not technically exist, but it's like about this close, And yeah, so in essence, as that was happening, Chinua Achebe points out that the whole concept of the dark continent emerged. And it referred not to, complexions. It referred instead to the idea that this was a scary place and that basically Europeans had to bring the light of civilization and colonize the place. And he also takes to account, um, drawing a blank here. Heart of Darkness. Yes. Joseph Conrad. Yeah. He takes that book to account. He also wrote a powerful essay calling it racist literature. And that became the subject of a lot of debate. And I kind of side with actually Conrad was, trying to work against that, but his book did have a lot of patently racist stuff in there, which was partly due to, him slipping it past the editors and the censors. And, portraying this book as something that, was somehow pro-colonial, but in fact was really deconstructing it, and telling how horrible the whole colonial process was. So yeah, it's interesting, and of course that was decades ago that he wrote that. So the debate, as we know it now, is ongoing from that. So yeah, but that was very interesting there. Dark continent, right? That concept, and how Kipling himself, by the time Kipling's there, yeah, imperialism is in full swing, and so he is now saying that he basically. And if you read the parts where Kipling mentions the white man's burden or the white man's duty, it's that, yeah, all these other people, they live only to feed their bellies. They're you-know-whats. And so that is our duty. We're here building civilization and civilizing people. And I have heard these kinds of statements, these attitudes, up until pretty recent in my life, And it is disgusting, really. It's vile, It's like, yeah, and well, we see this on our own soil here in Canada, in all the Americas, right? How we view the indigenous populations, and how there are efforts to this day to sanitize and rewrite history to make it sound like, oh, slavery wasn't that bad, right? There are those efforts happening in the States on the basis of DEI and CRT are bad. So now we're going to peddle a completely whitewashed, very much pun intended, version of history. Yeah, and Mr. Gamble's very good at summarizing this there, right? It's like this is the colonial mentality. Oh, aren't we wonderful for coming here and doing these things? Oh, of course, we don't stress what we're actually doing, right? No, we try to portray it as a benevolent thing. And it's like that's the exact same crap slavers in the American South, and I'm guessing all corners of the Americas where slavery existed, that's how they tried to portray it. It's like, oh, it's a benevolent thing. We're like a family. We love each other. Papa is, of course, the white guy, and he's in charge, and it's like you'd hear that kind of narrative, uh, and like in the very next breath, they're talking about, oh yeah, the runaway slaves. Yeah, I got a system there where I yank out their toenails, or I hobble them, or break their ankles, so that they can still work while they heal. And yeah, and of course it's like, oh my God, you hypocrites, you liars, you lie to yourselves, you are the worst. And yeah, I even heard someone peddling that kind of narrative, how her grandpa was a really nice man who had, people on his plantation, I guess you could call them slaves, her exact words. So it's like, yeah, these attitudes are not behind us. The past is not the past. It's not even past, right? Um, and yeah, so this book I highly recommend, although it is a bit tough. I remember a friend of mine who was reading this book in a separate class, I think, same class, just different period. And yeah, and she had a hard time with it because of the misogyny that's depicted. And it's depicting, not endorsing, right? But it doesn't really matter. It's hard to read like that. So this is kind of along the lines of The Great Gatsby. I've heard similar complaints there, right? There's no redeeming female characters in that book. There's abuse and violence against women depicted in that book. It's like, well, yeah, here there's violence and abuse depicted too. Um, and the female characters are, well, they're not really that developed because, of course, it's like, well, the main story, but they certainly are there, and they're not dehumanized by Achebe himself. So I highly recommend reading it. May take a little stomach, but I strongly recommend it because, yeah. But prior to reading this book, and as I was reading it, I felt that whole process like, oh yes, I'm learning stuff about a part of the world I knew nothing about except for the stereotypes that you hear. They're starving people, and that was a very popular one throughout the 1980s and 90s, and of course, dictators and genocide and all warlords and all that stuff. That is what we hear about Africa almost exclusively. We don't learn a damn thing about their culture unless we make the effort. Their culture. Yeah. Also, I should stress that, Africa is a continent, not a country. So there is that sort of ignorance too. It's like geographically ignorant people often seem to think that continents are a country. I've heard there was an American person who said on television once, "I thought Europe was a country, and that Paris was the capital of Europe." Like, ooh, yeah. So in fact, yes, it's like it is good to read from different African authors too, because of course the geographical and cultural and linguistic and political, all the diversity that is there. It is really so intense, and I love. This is sort of where that learning curve started for me, and I went on to really. I'm still learning about it. Yeah, and took African history in university in part because I was inspired, and I did my essay on Heart of Darkness because I was determined to see exactly what was there. Anyway, so that is Things Fall Apart, and of course, based on the epic poem, uh, It's Keats. Keats's poem Things Fall Apart, and with that sort of undertone to it. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is released upon the world. God, I can barely remember the guy's name, but I remember like the whole first stanza. Um, and and yeah, so in its telling of coming disaster, which is colonization. But of course, Achebe was very much for healing in the modern age by embracing difference and embracing each other is what he's recommending. Um, and if I recall correctly, he moved to Britain, I think. That was the story behind several of these authors. And the reason for that, the thing you have to understand, right, is like, um, Chinua Achebe and countless academics and scholars, and yes, Kashimoto, my personal acquaintance and friend and mentor on so many things. Yeah, he too was part of this sort of generation where you actually had during the interwar years, right, between World War I and World War II, and this comes up not so much in Things Fall Apart there, but definitely in Chinua Achebe's book and Guge Wathiogo's, um, and yeah, they show how between the wars there was a movement by the colonial nations, right? They did seem to understand after World War I, all that anti-imperialist stuff, all that self-determination of nations that we talked about as a war justification and was written right into the Treaty of Versailles. They actually did take that seriously to a point, right? They would betray such promises, of course, when, as they proved to be inopportune. But yeah, in the case of Britain and France, especially Britain, there was a move on in between the war years to build up these countries. And they really only did that in terms of education, right? They didn't exactly build functioning economies in these places, but they did build schools. And so of course, these schools were mainly about teaching European values and so forth. But the students could not fail to see the blatant contradiction between the values that European civilizations they exalted and hailed, right? The writings of the philosophers and of thinkers like Rousseau and John Locke, Bentham, Hobbes, and John Stuart Mill. And yeah, all of the I'm trying to think of more philosoph names, but look them up. Yeah, all of these thinkers who were, with the exception of Hobbes, of course, all of these thinkers were very pro-democratic and rights of the individual and freedom and all that stuff. They expounded on this endlessly. And so, yeah, African students, they took to that. And it's like, well, then, if you believe in that, why the hell are you doing all this? And yes, this did produce a generation of new leaders, of people who would then go on as part of the independence movement to fight for change, and many who were intellectuals and artists and inspired through that means. After independence, they faced censorship and crackdowns from a string of military governments or just petty dictatorships, right? So yes, a lot of them ended up moving out of the countries where they were born, raised, and were educated. But yeah, armed with their education, they went on to raise awareness and fight for liberation. And whether that was for countries that still hadn't gained their independence, or countries like, say, for example, South Africa that had apartheid type governments. Uh, Settler colonies, basically. Yeah. Yeah, fighting for change there. This is something that they would carry on doing. And Chinua Achebe is a very good example of it, and this is his first book. Anyway, so, next up, I will be reviewing Buchi Emechita. She is also Nigerian, also who moved to Britain there, and became a very well-known, very well-respected author talking about, similarly, coming from an Igbo background. So that basically applies to southern Nigeria, right? That's where you'd find the Igbo people of today, as well as I was told this, Ibuza and Yoba. Those are like the big nations in the south, whereas you have the Hausa to the north, which were were Islamic converts largely, and yeah. So that is part of the dynamical breakdown, demographic breakdown, and the cultural dynamics of the country. And Buchi Machida she was a wife who was basically sold to a man who was very abusive, and she got free of him and got to England and dedicated herself to writing about her experiences and also her cultural background. She did a wonderful job of that in The Joys of Motherhood. And it's a book that, in the very opening page there, the dedications, it's to all mothers. And boy, did it make me appreciate my mother more. So yeah, anyone out there, I want to borrow a line from Working Moms, the Catherine Reitman show. It's great, hilarious, and informative. Yes, one of her characters, a woman is walking by with her child, and the child is being a total little jerk, tantruming for no apparent reason. And she looks over and says, "Shut up, your mom's an angel." And the mother's like, "Thank you." And yeah, I want to borrow that there and say that, yes, don't give your mother a hard time, okay? And if you feel the need to at some point, make sure you say you're sorry. That's best advice I can give. Your experiences may vary, right? Anyway, I'll be covering that book next, and it is brilliant, it is genius, and it was a very good companion read to Things Fall Apart, because it's like it picks up practically where Things Fall Apart leaves off, and it's looking at things from the woman's point of view, who comes from a similar cultural background. And it covers, the warriors and all that stuff there, and yeah. And it did actually inform a lot of my opinions on a few things, especially, suffering in our society and how people treat those who've suffered. Anyway, on that, I will talk more at some later date. Haven't picked it yet, don't worry. It's much like Things Fall Apart. That book is strangely fresh in my memory. I've forgotten others, but these books did make an impression, which only sort of highlights the fact that I forgot to include them in this. It's like, what the hell, man? Ugh. A little suspect, frankly. Anyway, but I'm fixed. I chosen to amend that, so that one is still coming, to be followed by Ngugi Wa Thiong'o's Weep Not Child. Thank you, and have a good one.